Sure.
Great.
Yep. Okay. Well, Bart, thanks for talking to CCTV, as we call it.
My pleasure.
Curtain Call TV. Thanks for taking the time. How are you enjoying your sojourn in Australia this time around?
I love being in Sydney. I think Sydney is one of the great cities in the world, and I've been lucky enough to go to a lot of places, and I think it's amazing. And every time I come, I kind of love it even more each time. So it's nice being here.
Good to have you. Now, I don't want to get personal. We'll get political instead.
Yeah, okay.
Because we've been talking about that before we went to air, as it were.
Yeah, yeah.
But I did read a biographical detail about your sort of family history.
Yeah, yeah.
Where you grew up in a blended family.
I did, yes, indeed.
Family.
I did, in fact.
So I thought that was particularly interesting, given where you've ended up as this Tony Award-winning director of South Pacific.
Perhaps, yeah.
And the sort of racial themes involved there. Do you think your upbringing has informed your direction of South Pacific in some way, or informed your life more generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about going back to something like South Pacific, having it being written in '49, immediately following the war, where Rodgers and Hammerstein were busy trying to make sense of what kind of country they were living in, and they were in their own right somewhat liberal. The question that the piece poses is who gets to be in our family? Who gets to be a member of your family? And when we were doing this in 2000, and as a person growing up in the 60s and 70s in San Francisco who had, you know, basically a white family, middle to upper middle class family, my parents split up. My mother married a Chinese American, and so I was suddenly pulled into a whole other thing, plus living in a much more multicultural, you know, country at the time. I found that that was very interesting as I experienced this, and then it goes even further for me into when we were doing it in 2008, and which has lasted since, which we used to kind of quietly say it was the gay marriage musical. Not because it was about being gay, but
it's
because,
very topical here.
yeah, but it was because it's the same question. Who gets to be allowed into your family, and how much, who gets to sit around the kitchen table? Who gets to be there at the weddings and the funerals and to celebrate everything about who you are within the sort of closest unit in your life, which is your family? And I think that when Nellie learns at the end of the piece that she has to be different toward DeBeck's kids and include them in her life, this white girl from Arkansas. It was a huge and revolutionary moment, certainly in the history of musicals, and was using the musical form to push into very non-traditional areas of content for what could be in a musical and in our lives.
Particularly for the time, it strikes me, because, as you say, 1949, I mean, certainly prior to that, during the war years, we had all these sort of blockbuster entertainment epics, which really, by and large, wouldn't have, to the best of my recollection and knowledge, wouldn't have really dared. They wouldn't have gone there.
Yeah.
So it was a very bold move by Rodgers.
It was bold. There's a question that DeBeck asks of Captain Brackett, where he says, "What are you fighting for?" And that question is an interesting one, and I think in '49, immediately after having survived this great struggle, that was the question. What did we fight for? What kind of people do we want to be? So that led to civil rights, voting rights, women's rights, gay and lesbian rights. It led to a lot of changes that were immediately going to follow if we were to survive that kind of struggle for what we believed in.
So is that primarily what attracted you to South Pacific, more so even than the songs or the entertainment value per se?
Well, because I started in the theater, I would probably more convincingly say I was very struck. I liked the content of it, but I was struck by the enormous intelligence of the writing of the book of the musical. It was a given that the music was great, but I was surprised by how good the book writing of Hammerstein and Josh Logan appeared to me. It was a very beautifully structured and written play that also was well supported by great music. And that is, you know, I've talked a lot about what makes a great musical, but without both of those things, you really can't make a great musical. And that's not one that lasts. And so it really, I was very moved by the script itself and found it very powerful. I mean, obviously the music, you know, explodes that 100%, but it was still impressive.
How would you, if this isn't too political a question in terms of the arts world, how would you rate South Pacific against some of the musicals we're seeing now? Because it strikes me you're talking about a great book for South Pacific.
Yeah.
I'm not getting a sense, by and large, from musicals I've seen lately, that is necessarily transpiring to be the case. And
well, there are very different kinds of musicals, and they have different kinds of things. So I'm more on the favor, I err more on the side of a good book musical, storybook musical. But, I mean, it doesn't mean, it doesn't mean that a spectacle musical or, you know, you can take, there always seems to be this thing about like, oh, they're making them out of every movie. Well, there really isn't the point. They made them out of every play before, or they made them out of Holinshed's Chronicles if you were Shakespeare. The issue is really, does it have the right bones and structure for a musical? Does it have reasons to sing? And can you build enough plot out of it to create enough dramatic event to have a reason to come down to the footlights, lift your eyes up, and sing about something? And then, so I don't have any, you know, a great musical is a great thing no matter when it happens or who does it, because they're like Mount Everest of the entertainment world. They're extremely difficult to make because they require such a weird combination of talents. You have to have a great music writer, a great lyricist, a great book writer, directing. I mean, they require a lot, and they are always built on very intense collaborations, whether it's Sondheim with James Lapine or whether it's Arthur Lawrence with Sondheim and with Leonard Bernstein, or, you know, they require pretty high level of skill. So that's what makes them work. They're pushing now into more spectacle-driven things, and you know, those things can, you know, be mind-blowing too. Nothing wrong with them. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's no. I'm not a person with rules like, oh, a real musical is this and a real thing is that. No, you know, you pay a certain amount of money, you sit in a room without distraction for 2 hours, and something happens to you. It can happen in a lot of ways. So,
a bit of insight into what you do, perhaps, particularly given that you've been so successful in what you do, and it's been acknowledged.
Well, thank you.
Publicly.
Thanks.
I mean, it's not coming from me; it's coming from the awards you've got. But it's day one. You've just been awarded, you know, the role of director for Opera Australia, South Pacific. Where does a director begin with something like that? What is?
Well, it's different for different things. I mean, if it's essentially where I would always begin is if it's an opera, I would begin with the music. And so when I'm preparing an opera, I actually have a long process that's involved. I spend about 2 weeks with a friend of mine who's really good at music, and we break it down. We pick 6 great recordings that represent different approaches over, say, the last 60 years, and we go through it note for note. And because I don't read music, I literally have to write it out like dee-dum, 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 dee-dum times 5, and I go through the entire score. And it takes a long time, and I always hate it, and I survive it, and I go through it, but you have to learn every single part of the internal structure of an opera. From that, I will then begin a design process, because while I'm doing that, I'm also trying to make sense of the historical context in which it was written, or you know, or the story itself, or what have you. So I did an opera last year at the Met, L'Elysir d'Amore, and it sort of occurred to me that it was, having gone through that process, I kind of realized it was a kind of oppression narrative. That when it was originally written, it was written for 2 audiences. It was written for the Austrians who were occupying Milan at the time to see a beautiful comedy, and for the Italians who were listening to it to realize that the secret narrative of it was to give them the strength to figure out how to someone like Nemorino in that opera, to learn to be strong enough to overthrow his oppressors. This is common if you know African drama or you know drama in any oppression situation. So I just take whatever history there is, and I'd secretly built in a kind of design and idea around that idea. I couldn't recreate the conditions of Milan, you know, in 1830, whatever it was, for the Met in 2012, but I was looking for those resonances. Then it becomes interesting to me because I found its immediate significance for me, where I live with it, where I land in it, and then I build out from there. I'm also always looking for metaphoric resonances and other things, but I can't get that until I build up enough intuition about the piece from deeply analyzing the narrative, the music, and the different content of it. I didn't approach South Pacific as a piece which was meaningful to me because I was from a mixed, a family like I was from, but I discovered in it that it also resonated in my life, which meant it maybe resonated in other people's lives. And then I put those pieces together as I was going along. So the short answer to that question, which seemed really long, that answer is that I do start really with the text and the material in front of me as unblemished as I can as I try to crack into what it is. I'm also always looking for subtext, and I'm always looking for essentially, and this is me personally, what is fundamentally subversive about the piece to an audience in a conscious or unconscious way, because I think the best kind of art is kind of transformative or guides you to rethink and relearn, because it's this alternate fiction through which you can experience some part of living that you didn't actually have to physically go through. I mean, if I like Oedipus, it's not because I wanted to sleep with my mother. But when I'm watching Oedipus, I'm realizing it's got a deeper, more subversive thing about who I don't know myself to be and what happens when I actually finally face that. So you're looking at those kind of layers of things, and you're trying to get an audience out of its head, out of its computer, out of its consciousness, and into enough of a story to be released into the world of its poetry, its ideas, its content, so that they could be potentially transformed by it. That's the kind of magic thing that can happen, which is higher than just entertained by it. And it is to pull you out of it. And it is on the assumption that there is things out in the world which are strong enough through art to make you think bigger about things than you would if you were by yourself. So that's fun, and I try to participate in that.
And do you think South Pacific is, as written, is something that wears its subversiveness on its sleeve? No,
definitely not. So yeah, and also for me it's very much, I can't speak about Australia, but it was very much an American piece of work. It had a lot of fundamental good things about the story we want to tell ourselves about the America we want. And it's American artists and American ideas and American history. So it was appealing to me as a person who grew up in the crazy context of America in the 60s and 70s and how much we've changed and all that. And as an artist working in that country in a dramatic form, it was satisfying. So yeah, I mean, I look at all that stuff.
And the original production, of course, the original Broadway production, I think ran for close to
5 years.
Yeah, 5 years. Is that, obviously you've got great material to start with in terms of the book, in terms of the songs, but is that just the overwhelming success of the original production, did that make it a great pressure on you as a revival director, as it were?
Yes, enormously huge, ridiculous pressure. So
is that a silly question? Probably.
No. The trick was that so many people, it was so beloved as a musical that the revival fundamentally had to be better than the people's memory of the original was. So it had to do something which like got them out of their heads enough to like release into the story again and enjoy it even more if they could. So that's what the pressure was. And we were lucky enough to be able to be in the Beaumont at Lincoln Center, which is such a big, beautiful space that you could kind of paint the picture bigger. So that is always the hard thing about a revival, is that it has, especially if something very beloved, is that it has to play in the memory of the piece, in the memory of the audience's memory of the piece at a very high level. And it has to maybe be better, which, I'm not saying it is fundamentally better, but that experience was so core and so much about being alive in '49, and most of the people watching it had survived that war. You had to create a circumstance in 2008 in which you had as much of that experience sort of built into it so that they could re-experience that. And that was a chore.
Do you think nostalgia works in your favor in that sense, or against you?
I don't...
Or an equal measure?
I always find nostalgia to be a somewhat negative word, because nostalgia means a kind of a kind of manipulation of the past to a better thing than it was.
Or a false memory.
Yeah, and I was just trying to get to the real memory of it. So I didn't think of it in terms of nostalgia. We had a lot of people who'd seen the original who loved ours, and that was very satisfying. And we didn't have a lot of, oh, the original was better. So I think we were okay. It's also true, like, if you do something which has had more than one incarnation, a movie, a book, a film, you want to make something which is original enough to itself that they can enjoy the new incarnation, not compare it to its previous incarnation. And I think that's what we tried to do.
And for generations now, and this even applies to the, many of the cast, I assume, who don't necessarily, they're not quite as old as you or I perhaps, don't necessarily have the same recollections, aren't
no, definitely
in the
not.
same ways.
No, I mean, because I was playing a lot about racism, we brought a lot of people into the original cast, and some of them were medical and military history, and the African-American guys who were in the cast were disbelieving of the depth of the segregation that went on in World War II, until, guys came in and said, no, it's so much worse than you had ever heard, and then started to describe in detail that they were actually fundamentally shocked. The segregation was profound and deep and very, very deeply buried into the ways of behaving. And when we just put that into the way we behaved rather than into like a statement about that, it was more interesting for us. And so we had to learn. We had to learn ourselves what it was like.
And you have Christine Anu in the cast now, of course. It seems to me that that is a very clever casting decision, not just because she's a transcendently good singer and performer, but because of her Torres Strait Islander identity. Does that help bring forward the themes in an Australian context, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand that it actually brings up a misunderstanding that a lot of people have about Bloody Mary. She's not an islander. She's Vietnamese. She's an imported worker.
Sure.
So what's interesting about having Christine do it, I mean, what you really realize is that actually Rodgers and Hammerstein didn't understand who Bloody Mary was, based on the book.
So she was kind of amorphous.
Yeah, they kind of invented this character which had an experience of the islander, but in fact, if you looked at her real background based on Michener, she was an imported worker. That's why there's all the struggle with the captain and with Debec. They couldn't get the island people. The woman he's having he had these children by is an islander. She's essentially black. Bloody Mary is Vietnamese, and she's an imported worker who's playing on all of this other stuff. So what you essentially have is this profoundly mixed culture that's all been sort of dumped into this pot of, Espiritu Santo, this weird island in the South Pacific, and they're all mixed in there. I think Christine is interesting because she brings the experience of an island experience and an outsider experience that she's had to grow up with living in Australia. So she completely kind of gets both. We've never had anybody who was genuinely an islander in the piece because I cast somebody who was Filipino, essentially. That's not Vietnamese, but that's how layered and complicated all the even in the area of Espiritu Santo where this happens, there are 32 separate ethnic groups with 32 separate languages. And so the complexity of all the stuff is like insane. Christine, though, is somebody who brings kind of this depth of both of those to it, and that's been actually a really big, kind of beautiful for me at this stage of working on the show again, because she brings a kind of real power to it from both points of view.
I guess I was thinking in terms of white Australia's point of view too. We're seeing Bloody Mary, but we're also seeing Christine, of course.
Yeah.
And there's that awareness that here is someone that, as a whole country, white and black, we've celebrated greatly. And at the same time, we still live in a country which doesn't recognise Aboriginal people in the Constitution.
That particular history, I tried to deal with that history when I got here, and that is different than ours because our layers of racism are fundamentally different than how they operate here. Most people here don't think. Americans very much have their racism on their sleeve. They've confronted it so much. We always have issues about it. We've had race rights. We've all those things. Here, I find people don't fundamentally think of themselves honestly, I don't mean that they're not honestly, of how the racism plays such a significant part in their lives. And how profoundly it's worked through. In America, we're much more careful and sensitive about those things. Here, I'm not so sure. It's not a criticism. I think it's interesting.
A phrase springs to mind, which one hears a lot. I'm not a racist, but.
Yeah. I mean, I do think the layers of how those things operate in a culture like this one are different because, you know, who the dominant culture is obviously white guys. And it's a more sexist culture than I experience it even in the U.S. too. So that's complicated. So I don't know. We don't have to talk about that. But it's possibly, I mean, it's just interesting. I mean, just in political terms, it's, you know, it's fun.
Yeah. So South Pacific, where do you go from here? You've spent a lot of time on it now.
Well, this is probably my last experience having worked on it for a long time. I've been thinking about that. I think what I feel luckiest about in this version is I feel very lucky to be finishing it with Lisa McCune because she's such an incredibly great actress that I find working with her and with Teddy to be very refreshing in terms of reinvestigating the material. I don't think we've, you know, with all due respect to the people who played it before, I don't think there's ever been a better actor who's played that part that I've worked with.
I wasn't going to ask.
Yeah, she's pretty amazing. And she brings new things and she likes to explore. And I'm one of those people who doesn't like things staying the same. I like to take the same material and keep kind of digging and digging and digging and digging. And that part's been really beautiful with her. And her and Teddy are they have a very strong relationship. But at the same time, I think it's been very rewarding. At the same time, it's like with Christine and with Guyton, they're all very challenging with me and in a good way, and they bring a lot of intelligence and energy to it, so it's made it a kind of beautiful way for me to kind of work on it. You know, where do I go from here? I go back to New York and work on a new opera about, you know, the internet. That's my new thing. And then Bridges of Madison County and other new things, but still. I think South Pacific's been a very deep and important part of my work and in my life, so it's been beautiful to be able to finish it here.
Well, that seems like a good place to finish an interview.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brad. Cheers.
Cheers.
Beautiful.
Thank you.